Welcome to Countering the Social Media Threat. This is a short course presentation overview on countering the social media threat because it's increasingly a serious cybersecurity threat, but also it's a threat to our whole society, of course. I'm going to start with some dazzling graphics. This is actually called a dazzlement in the terminology of the art. What you see is not actually a moving picture. If you see dots changing colors or something like that, that's because of the way your brain and your cognitive system works. And the reason I put up this dazzling graphics is because we don't have a whole lot of graphics in this course. It's actually not about graphics, but I kind of thought that maybe you'd like some dazzling graphics just to get you started. Some background on me. There's a saying that you get, and it's been widely demonstrated, that when you're introduced as an expert, you'll be perceived as one. And of course, I have more than 60 years of experience in deception and counter-deception. That is, I'm more than 60 years old, and of course, every human being does deception and counter-deception. So ever since I was born, and ever since you were born. And I've been using the global social media since 1973. Yes, 1973. It did exist then. There was some form of social media. There were internet relay chat or the precursor to that. It was called the ARPANET. And I was on one of the very early nodes of the ARPANET, and I did this globally. I chatted with people in Europe and around the world at that time. I've also done U.S. government-funded research in the field. Now, what field is that exactly? Well, gee, that's a problem, because when we talk about social influence and the social media threat, that's a field that involves, well, there's lots of fields involved, and I've done research in some of them, maybe many of them, maybe even most of them, I don't know, but it's hard to tell from that background. I invented, designed, and implemented and/or operated counter-deception methods that are used in more than 90% of the computers in the world. Now, I just want to note, those mechanisms were largely about integrity checking, although we also have some methods specifically oriented towards social media and social influence. But one of the little tricks here that you might not have noticed is I'm talking now about deception instead of social media and influence operations. And where did I get that? Interesting. It turns out it's part of it, but it's a little bit subtle. I've used deception to enter facilities, systems, groups, enterprises, and so forth. That's true. I've done a lot of red teaming, is what we used to call it. Now they call it, I don't know what they call it. They keep calling it different things. Penetration testing is another word for it. I've won global awards in deception and counter-deception, actually in integrity checking. I was named the most famous hacker of all time by ABC News in 2009. And so that's a true statement, but that had to do with my work in computer viruses, not about social media influence. I've never been accused or convicted of any crime. There you go. Now the assertion here, of course, is that I'm honest, but what it really means is, well, at a minimum, I've never been successfully caught, or something like that. I have Twitter handles at FC0. My website is all.net. My blog, which is not what I call it, but what people call it, started in 1995, which is to say I've been in this social media space for a very long time. So I've had a lot of crap thrown at me, and I've thrown a lot of crap back. I've also held top-level U.S. government security clearances, whatever top means. Who knows what top level is? But one way or the other, I have had security clearances in the U.S. government, as have, I guess, a number of criminals and some of the people from Germany after World War II who worked on nuclear research. So I'm in there with all the good guys and the bad guys, and also Snowden and those guys. I founded the College Cyber Defenders at Sandia National Labs, which was the precursor to the U.S. Cyber Corp. This is a combination here of the crown jewel of American ingenuity, or something, is what the national labs have been called by various presidents. Of course, had a huge impact, and then there's that educational reference that college. So it turns out I also do education in this arena, but all of these things are really here to say, I'm a friggin' expert in how to lie and counter your lie, so don't even try it. Or in other words, this is an influence operation, but I'm trying to point out the issues behind influence and how we interpret and misinterpret what people say. So, it's about, what do they say and what it means. And so here's a great one. How do you close a sale? So there are essentially three elements to closing a sale successfully. One is that you can trust me, so the personal trust thing. Next one is that you can trust my business, which is to say, it's not just me personally, it's whoever I represent, whatever you're buying from, whoever you're buying it from. And then the third one is that you really want what I have. So that's how you close a sale. Notice the asterisk, according to whom? Well, it's according to a convicted criminal with fraudulent businesses who's selling advice on how to sell. So this is a person that ripped off millions, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars from people in stock scams. That's now trying to make a living, I guess, by selling advice on how to sell. So, of course, on the other hand, when thing is, it works. I mean, he's telling the truth when he says that those are the things that are fundamental, or at least it worked to get me here in front of you today. And of course, it worked to get him millions and millions of dollars fraudulently. So the ability to sell is not necessarily the ability to sell something that's worth having. And finally, just because he's a crook doesn't mean everything he says is a lie. And he's done his time. So he's actually, paid the price to society as demanded. But there's a fundamental fallacy here, and the fallacy is, and it might also be true, but it worked, so it must be right. So it's really not true that just because something worked means that it's right. Things happen by accident, by coincidence, and so forth. So that's a fallacy, and we'll be talking more about fallacies later, because fallacies are really one of the mechanisms, or many of the major mechanisms that are used in social media influence campaigns. So naturally, I'm going to, in order to help you remember things, I'm going to introduce an acronym, SMILE. You can see the smiley face over there, SMILE. It's a bad acronym. Social Media Influence, SMILE, all in influence. But hopefully you'll smile and enjoy the rest of the day here. So social, we're talking about involving more than one human. Okay, that's what social means. Media, in the communications arena, so we're not talking about touching each other or anything. That's only about the social media. Although the day may come when we have those sensors, you can smell other people, the smell-o-phone or something. But in the meanwhile, for now, it's just going to be communications, and then influence is about targeting human cognitive systems. So really, that's what the topic is about. And when I talk about operations, I mean intentional, time-limited, coordinated actions with specific objectives. So typically, we're talking here about social media operations. These things that get coordinated to obtain some particular objectives. So in any case, make sure you smile and have a good day. And well, let's just talk a little bit more, because we're talking about the social media threat, encountering the threat. So what is a threat? Well, we typically talk about threat actors, as opposed to this generic notional threat that's everything about actors undertaking sequences of actions that produce sets of consequences over time. People talk about those as a threat, but it's sort of a too broad a term to really get your head around. So we're going to talk about the actors, and there are three types of actors we typically talk about, certainly in cybersecurity. One of them is nature, beasts, animals, pests, fungi, and so forth, storms, earthquakes, and so forth. And that's not what we're going to be talking about here. We're talking about individuals and groups. And so who are they? Who are these threats, these social media threats, these human beings communicating with you? They're us, okay? Individuals, every person out there is an actor in this space. If they want to connect to the internet and they're able to do so, then they're certainly on a global basis a potential threat from the social media perspective. And of course, groups, which is every person working with another person. So as soon as you're using any social media, you're interacting with another person. Coordinating and collaborating between them would make them a group. So SMILE, they're us. So every communicating human is seeking to influence other people or events or whatever. And so it's sort of a fundamental. The goal, of course, the reality is we compete in the marketplace of ideas. Our memes, our expressions are mental, reproducing memes is what they're called, thought processes, thoughts, views of the world. they compete in the marketplace of ideas, and the winners are the ones that, in some sense, reproduce more effectively and spread further and affect more people, or spread to the right people that then have a larger influence on other things that happen in the world. The challenge we're facing is not that we want no marketplace of ideas. We want that. The challenge is unfair competition in that marketplace. But what is it to be unfair, and what's unfair about it? And so really that distinction is about social norms, the social contract. So what is this social contract? And are we ready to renegotiate it? Is this something that has changed because of the effect of cyberspace and information, the information age, if you will? But rather than try and boil the ocean, let's just start with frauds. Okay, frauds are criminal acts under various statutes. And typically we're talking about theft by deception. You might look up something in a legal dictionary. There's a free online legal dictionary. There are other legal dictionaries. You can look it up and find various definitions. And I'm using approximate definitions here. I'm not using quotes from there because I want to tell you what I want you to think about. So theft is, we're talking about taking or depriving another of something of value without their consent. And theft by deception in particular, which is misleading another through intentionally false statements or fraudulent actions, including the failure to disclose when you're obligated to do so. And now, just to note, the definition of deception I typically use is induction or suppression of signals to cause behavioral changes in targets. And we'll see how those things mix together soon. So in some sense, it's about lying. But some people say, well, but it's a matter of context, right? Because if you're somebody working in the Russian influence operations or the Chinese influence operations or the US influence operations, trying to influence other people, other societies, then from your perspective, you may be doing something good. That is, but we're not going to talk about good and bad here, or about that sort of perspective. We're going to talk about lying and about deception. But I just want to mention, influence is something that we really desire in a free society. We want a marketplace of ideas. That's exactly the idea. That we have competing ideas, that people come up with new ideas, that the cleverest people that come up with the best new ideas and get them to work are more successful, and that society moves forward on that basis. That's what innovation is all about. That's what entrepreneurship is all about. But what we don't want is frauds. We don't want intentionally false statements. We don't want intentionally leaving out material facts. This is a fabulous home that I live in here, and it's for sale, and it's for $1.2 million, and it's got a fantastic view. Did I forget to mention it was bombed recently, and so all that's left is some burned out embers, but you can actually climb up to the top and still get that great view. So intentionally leaving out that material fact, that would be a fraud, or at least a lie. But statements made to lead people to false conclusions is also what I'm going to talk about here, because people have cognitive limitations. They interpret things in different ways. And you saw that, or you will see it soon. I just want to note the problem of intent. We talk about this from a criminal standpoint. If I lie to you, that's intentional. I lied. But if you repeat the lie, believing it to be true, you don't have any intent to lie. You're trying to speak the truth from the perspective of that you see it. So you don't have intent. But in the social arena, when I create a lie and you reproduce it, you repeat it, then you don't have the intent I did. So these influences are transitive in nature. And so now, of course, the question is, if you listen to anything I say, is there an obligation for you to check out the facts? And maybe or maybe not, especially if you're going to repeat it. Spreading rumors is not a good idea. But in practice, how would you do it? If I tell you I was born in 19 whatever, how would you know it's true? How can you check it out? Would you want to bother checking it out? How is that going to be materially important to anything out there? And do you really have an obligation to do it? So, more is less, more or less. Actually, I disdain these things like more is less. More is not less, it's more. Less is less, more is more. But, the more words we use, the more deception opportunities we have. I just want to point out, putting that in another way, the more verbiage presented in regards to any specific subject, the more opportunities are present for suppression or induction of signals so as to lead the recipient towards conclusions they might otherwise not come to, which is to say, oh, wait a minute. why am I talking about deception rather than social media? And so I've added a gratuitous misquote. You know, a lie will travel halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on, which is not actually a quote. It might be a quote from somebody, but it's not a quote from anybody famous from long ago, because lots of people have used different expressions that are similar to this, but not this particular one, although this might have been something by a famous football player recently. But the point is pretty straightforward. But I just want to point out, you know, as always, halfway around the world in both directions gets you everywhere, gets you all the way around. So it's only going halfway around the world, but in both directions, or in all 360, you know, points of the compass. So halfway around the world is actually all the way around the world. Oops. And then another note here is that the challenge, you know, of social media for honest people is deception. But then, you know, nobody is perfectly honest. It's not the nature of human beings. We're not completely logical mechanisms that always express only, you know, mathematically true statements. It's just not how we are. I guess one of the points here is that you got to be careful when you see a lot of words, because, you know, what do they mean? And when you see these words, think about what they might mean. And so I just want to talk, before I give you my next example, about three threads we're going to talk about here. One of them is consequences. Next one is how it works, and the third one is responses. So the consequences are important to understand for various reasons, but maybe more important than anything else is that you need to characterize the consequences in order to make good decisions about how to behave and how to act on things that you see. So as part of a response regimen, understanding consequences and the time frames for those consequences is vitally important. You know, a lie can spread halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on. So, but if we can get the pants on the truth faster, maybe we can make it so it doesn't spread as far. But in the information age, halfway around the world only takes, well, not very long, certainly less than a second in many cases. So how do we, you know, stop this transitive spread? I just want to note the consequences. These are cognitive things, right? These influence operations, the social media, it's cognitive in nature. It has to do with the way things are interpreted and understood. And so there's an emotional element to it. The cognitive mechanisms trigger emotional responses in people's brains and change chemistry and all sorts of things. And that produces behaviors. So, you know, we can't really and don't want to control how people think, but we do want to limit behaviors so they don't go killing people, or, you know, going into pizza places somewhere in New York and you know, trying to shoot people because they heard something in social media. And then it's not just individual behavior, it's groups. So group behavior gets influenced. You end up with whole, you know, groups of hundreds, thousands, of millions of people that have some set of beliefs or whatever they have that has an emotional context for them that produces behaviors. Now the group behavior becomes much worse and self-fulfilling in some sense, and produces positive feedback and groupthink and these things. I'm going to mention financial consequences in here because financial consequences today tend to be a route to societal consequences. So if you're a company and you're trying to defend against the social media threat, it's usually about the financial situation of the company. But somehow finance is embedded in most of the things of our lives. It's a representative system that represents the value associated with labor and things and resources and so forth. So when I say financial, I'm really talking about utility. And then of course there's the societal impacts. So, you know, whole societies just change in their point of view, you know, so that, you know, you end up changing the whole social norms. When you change the social norms, you're going to change the behavior over time of the entire society. And of course, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that it's a consequence of these cognitive effects. And the more we communicate, the more we come to understand each other. Maybe we get much better as a global world, or maybe, you know, we scatter apart into smaller groups, or we become more dependent on the things that we believe make people similar to us, you know, like what they look like and how they speak. I just want to point out that the consequences here are effectively boundless. We have no idea of what the full range of limitations of what humans can be and human society can be and do over time. So there's no easy way to bound it in the sense of saying, well, if we let this one thing come out, then it's going to destroy everything about humankind, and we'll never go out into space, and we'll all die because the sun will eventually envelop the Earth, as opposed to some other meme that gets out there, some other, gene of an idea, seed of an idea that gets out there that causes us all to decide, well, we're going to continue to work towards, moving to outer space, and we're going to eventually, free ourselves of Earth and the solar system we're in, and get out of the galaxy so that when the galaxies collide, humanity survives. Whatever that human thing will be then, of course, it'll be evolved from here. So the second thread is how it works. In particular, these cognitive effects have to do with how people's brains work. And so there have been a lot of studies of this in the social sciences. And basically, we understand that there are various cognitive errors. And when we talk about deception, we're talking about inducing cognitive errors. So there are causes, the induction or suppression of information, that act through mechanisms, these cognitive errors, to produce effects. People, end up being tricked, and tricked into things that are maybe bad for them or what have you. But that's just how influence is, how false influence is. Honest, truthful influence doesn't exploit these errors. Because most of the things that people developed as cognitive mechanisms work because they work in the normal day-to-day world that we live in. And as long as most people are reasonably honest, then these things will work well, and it'll benefit all of us, and we'll learn how to work together and communicate. We see effects. We don't see causes directly. Sometimes we might be able to observe them, but normally what we see is effects. We don't see the mechanisms. The mechanisms are derived. They're analytically, identified by social scientists who study these things and tested in repeated experiments. But we see the effects. And so what we ultimately want to do, presumably, is to detect, these deceptions, frauds, what have you. We want to attribute them to their sources. We want to interdict them so that they don't necessarily spread through to everybody, everywhere, forever. We want to be able to react to them. That is, besides the interdiction, once it's already hit, once somebody already has that idea, how do we, counter that influence, counter the effect of it, or at least limit its effect, or bring them some of the truth back so they don't get defrauded. And then how do we adapt? Ultimately, over time, we're going to do much better than we can do today. And that's, of course, one of the major goals of research and development. And then the third element here is responses. And there are a range of responses that can be taken. You can take the authoritarian response that basically says, well, we're not going to have any more lies. We're not going to have any free press. We're not going to have the internet. We're just going to control it all. Something similar to what has been done, typically historically in Russia and in China. The control of information is very strong. And I don't want to, deprecate the extent to which it's been in other places, including the United States and Europe and so forth. And of course, over time in lots of other countries. Another response is war on them. Whoever it is that we identify as them, maybe it might be the wrong them. We might decide that, because somebody blew up a building in New York and the Pentagon, that we're going to attack another country. There's a response. Pushback. You don't have to be passive. You can push back at lies. You can, try and push out the fact that those are lies, and just tell other people it's not true. They lied about me. And there are other ways to push back, including lawsuits and so forth. Education. We could try educating, the people of the world, so they understand these influence operations, so they understand cognitive errors, so they understand the limits of their own ability to discern the truth and become better at making judgment. We can apply technology. So there are all sorts of technological solutions. What we want to be careful of, I think it's obvious, but some people might not. We want to be careful that the technology doesn't damage the marketplace of ideas, because we want the marketplace of ideas. We want free ideas. We want free speech. What we don't want is, frauds and deceptions becoming the dominant, force that guides society. Lots of legal actions can be taken, and there are various ones out there. Flight's another interesting response. That's where I say, okay, I'm just going to get off social media. It'll have no effect on me. Of course, it will have a lot of effect on you because it affects the people around you. But it is a response. And then self-restraint. People not doing these sorts of things. deciding that this is not something that we want to do as a society and bringing up our children to shun this sort of behavior. And so those are the three threads we're going to be talking about. And before I go on to the more in-depth part of the course, I'm going to go to another real world example. And it turns out I worked at Sandia National Labs, for many years, and I've spoken officially on nuclear weapons security for Sandia. And one of the things that I said, this isn't the exact statement, I don't think, but no U.S. nuclear weapon has ever fallen into the hands of any adversary. Actually, I didn't say it, but somebody officially said something to this effect while I was there. Well, that's the end of this intro section. We're going to take a break now, and when you come back, we'll remove the black part and find out what's really going on.